Welcome to Truth Behind History, where we dive deep into the past to uncover the economic forces that shaped our world. Today, we're exploring one of the darkest yet most economically significant chapters in human history, the Atlantic slave trade. This wasn't just a moral tragedy, it was a massive financial machine that fueled European empires, devastated African societies, and left economic ripples that are still felt today. This video isn't just about history, it's about understanding how money, power, and exploitation were intertwined in ways that still shape our world today. Let's begin with the foundation of it all, a system of exploitation. The transatlantic slave trade wasn't just about forced labor, it was a global economic engine designed to enrich European nations at the cost of millions of African lives. European powers didn't just stumble into slavery, they built entire economies around it. Enslaved people weren't viewed as humans but as economic assets, commodities bought, sold, insured, and traded like sugar or cotton. This system generated unimaginable wealth for European merchants, plantation owners, and financial institutions, all while ripping apart African societies. But the impact of this trade wasn't just confined to one region, it stretched across continents. This brings us to the triangular trade, a system that linked Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a web of commerce. Goods such as weapons, textiles, and alcohol were shipped to Africa in exchange for enslaved people. Those enslaved people were then forcibly transported to the Americas under horrifying conditions. Once in the New World, they produced cash crops like sugar, tobacco, and cotton, which were then sent back to Europe, fueling the Industrial Revolution. This economic cycle created massive wealth for some while inflicting suffering on millions. And that suffering didn't end when the slave trade was abolished. The economic consequences of slavery didn't just disappear, they evolved. The wealth generated from slavery helped build the foundations of modern economies, while its brutal legacy left lasting financial disparities that persist to this day. Now that we've set the stage, let's break it down further by looking at the mechanics of the triangular trade system. To understand just how deeply intertwined slavery was with the global economy, we have to break down the mechanics of the triangular trade system. This wasn't just a simple exchange, it was a carefully structured, profit-driven machine that fueled the rise of European empires. First, let's talk about what started this vicious cycle: European goods exchanged for slaves. European merchants loaded their ships with manufactured goods, guns, textiles, alcohol, and other trade items, and set sail for the African coast. These goods weren't sent as charity, they were deliberately chosen to destabilize African societies, making it easier for European traders to manipulate local leaders. Firearms, for example, were in high demand because they allowed African kingdoms to wage wars against their neighbors, capturing prisoners who could then be sold into slavery. This created a brutal feedback loop. Warfare led to more captives, which led to more slaves, which led to more European goods flooding the region. Once these enslaved individuals were purchased, they were forced onto ships for the next phase of the trade, one of the most infamous journeys in history, the Middle Passage. Over 12 million Africans were crammed into the hulls of ships like cargo, shackled together in unbearable conditions. Diseases spread rapidly, food was scarce, and those who resisted were brutally punished. Many didn't survive the journey, but for those who did, a life of forced labor awaited them in the Americas. But why was this happening? What was the incentive behind this horrific trade? The answer lies in the economic output of plantations. European colonists in the Americas weren't just growing food for survival, they were running massive cash crop operations, producing sugar, cotton, and tobacco on an industrial scale. These products were then shipped back to Europe, where they became the backbone of economies, fueling industries like textiles, rum production, and refined sugar markets. In short, plantations in the Americas generated raw materials, Europe processed and sold the finished goods, and Africa supplied the enslaved labor to keep the entire system running. This trade wasn't just an unfortunate byproduct of history, it was an economic strategy, designed and sustained by governments, traders, and industrialists for over 300 years. Now that we've seen how the system functioned, let's take a closer look at who profited from it. So, who actually made money from the transatlantic slave trade? The answer: nearly every major economic power at the time. The profits weren't limited to plantation owners. This was a multi-industry, multinational financial network that enriched entire cities, fueled banking empires, and even helped spark the Industrial Revolution. Let's start with the European port cities that thrived because of the slave trade. Places like Liverpool and Bristol in England became booming economic hubs, not just because they were ports, but because they specialized in shipping enslaved people, plantation goods, and manufactured products. Merchant families made enormous fortunes from trafficking enslaved Africans, and those profits funded the development of new businesses, infrastructure, and even cultural institutions. Many of the grand buildings and financial centers in these cities were funded by the wealth of slavery. Then, we have the plantation owners, perhaps the most obvious beneficiaries. Enslaved labor didn't just make agriculture more productive, it completely transformed it. Without the costs of wages, plantation owners could focus purely on maximizing output. Sugar and cotton weren't just profitable, they were global commodities. The wealth generated from these crops made plantation owners some of the richest individuals in the world. Their profits allowed them to expand, buy more land, and, tragically, purchase even more enslaved people to increase production further. But here's something most people don't realize: the slave trade wasn't just about agriculture. The financial sector played a huge role in making sure this system kept running. Banks and insurance companies got involved, offering loans to slave traders and plantation owners, insuring human lives as property, and investing in the industry itself. The revenues from the slave trade provided capital that European banks funneled into industries like shipbuilding, textiles, and manufacturing. In other words, the Industrial Revolution, the very period that modernized economies, was partly funded by the wealth generated through slavery. So when we talk about the economic benefits of slavery, we're not just talking about a few wealthy plantation owners. We're talking about an entire economic system, one that spread its profits across different industries and set the foundation for many of today's financial institutions. Now that we understand where the money was going, let's shift our focus to the plantations themselves and examine the economic power of enslaved labor. At the heart of the transatlantic slave trade was the plantation economy. These plantations weren't just large farms, they were highly structured, profit-driven enterprises designed to extract the maximum amount of labor from enslaved people while minimizing costs for the owners. This system was ruthless in its efficiency, and it became the economic engine that powered European wealth. First, let's talk about the sheer scale of forced labor. Millions of enslaved people were put to work on sugar, cotton, and tobacco plantations, producing goods that were in massive demand across Europe and beyond. Unlike free labor, enslaved individuals had no wages, no rights, and no autonomy. This meant plantation owners could generate enormous profits with very little overhead. The economic logic was simple: the more labor they could exploit, the more wealth they could accumulate. One of the biggest drivers of this system was sugar. By the 18th century, sugar had become the economic king of Europe. It wasn't just a sweetener, it was a status symbol, a staple in tea and coffee, and a key ingredient in rum production. The demand for sugar was so high that it accounted for over 30% of European trade, and plantations in the Caribbean and Brazil were working at full capacity to keep up. But sugar production was brutal. Enslaved workers were forced to cut cane under the scorching sun, crush the stalks to extract juice, and process it into refined sugar, all under grueling conditions that led to extremely high mortality rates. Then there's cotton, the backbone of industrialization. The textile industry in Europe was booming, and cotton from plantations in the American South was essential to keeping those factories running. Enslaved laborers picked, cleaned, and prepared raw cotton, which was then shipped to textile mills in places like England and France. This raw material fed into the industrial economy, providing the fabric that clothed millions of people and driving technological advancements like the spinning jenny and power loom. In short, without enslaved labor, the textile revolution would have been much slower, if not impossible. The plantation economy wasn't just about agriculture, it was about creating an entire economic model where enslaved people were treated as disposable resources, where profit margins dictated life expectancy, and where wealth was funneled into the hands of the few at the expense of the many. But what happened when this system finally started to collapse? The abolition of slavery didn't just free people, it completely disrupted economies that had been built on forced labor. In the next section, we'll explore how the end of slavery reshaped the global economy. While the transatlantic slave trade enriched European powers and built economies in the Americas, it left behind a devastating economic and social toll on Africa. The impact of losing over 12 million people, many of whom were young, able-bodied workers, was catastrophic. Entire societies were destabilized, economies were weakened, and the effects can still be seen today. First, let's talk about the loss of human capital. When we think about wealth, we often think about gold, land, or resources, but one of the most valuable assets any society has is its people. The transatlantic slave trade robbed African nations of generations of workers, leaders, and innovators. Millions of young men and women were forcibly taken, creating massive labor shortages in agriculture, trade, and skilled professions. This loss of human capital stunted economic growth for centuries, leaving African nations at a disadvantage as European countries industrialized and expanded their economies. But the damage didn't stop there. The rise of slave trading kingdoms within Africa also had long-term consequences. Some African rulers, seeking to benefit from the trade, began capturing and selling their own people or waging wars against neighboring communities to secure captives. This created a dangerous cycle where wealth was built on destruction rather than productivity. Instead of growing economies through agriculture, trade, or industry, many regions became dependent on selling human lives. This not only weakened political stability but also created deep divisions between African societies, divisions that European colonizers would later exploit to take control of the continent. And that brings us to the final, long-term consequence: colonial exploitation. When the transatlantic slave trade ended, European nations didn't simply leave Africa alone. Instead, they shifted their focus to direct colonization. The weakened state of many African economies made them vulnerable to European takeover during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Colonizers justified their control by claiming that Africa was underdeveloped or uncivilized, ignoring the fact that it was their own slave trade that had drained the continent's economic potential in the first place. So, while slavery ended, its impact on Africa didn't. The legacy of economic devastation, lost labor, internal conflicts, and colonial rule helped shape modern inequalities that still persist today. Now, let's take a closer look at what happened when the slave trade was abolished and how economies were forced to adapt to a world without enslaved labor. The abolition of the transatlantic slave trade didn't just mark a moral victory, it triggered massive economic shifts across the world. Societies that had relied on enslaved labor for centuries suddenly had to restructure their economies. Plantation owners, industrialists, and governments scrambled to adapt, and the long-term effects were profound. First, let's look at what happened in the Americas. The end of the slave trade created massive economic disruptions, particularly for plantation owners. For centuries, enslaved labor had been their primary source of productivity, and without it, they faced immediate labor shortages. But instead of embracing fair wages and equal treatment, many landowners found new ways to maintain control over workers. Systems like sharecropping emerged, where formerly enslaved individuals were forced into exploitative agreements that kept them in cycles of debt and poverty. These arrangements were designed to mimic the economic benefits of slavery, just without the legal ownership of people. Meanwhile, in industrialized nations, mechanization was starting to reduce the need for human labor in certain sectors. The rise of factories and mechanized agriculture made it easier for economies to move away from slavery. For example, in Britain, the Industrial Revolution meant that textile mills could now process cotton more efficiently with machines rather than relying on enslaved laborers to clean and prepare raw materials. The shift toward industrialization made slavery less economically necessary for some nations, which in turn helped fuel abolitionist movements. But let's be clear, many governments and businesses didn't end slavery out of moral enlightenment. Economic incentives played a major role in abolition. Britain, for example, banned the slave trade in the early 19th century, but part of the motivation was strategic. By ending the trade, Britain could undermine rival economies that still depended on enslaved labor. Additionally, wage labor in a capitalist economy was proving to be more profitable in the long run. Rather than owning workers outright, businesses realized they could simply pay wages, avoiding the costs of housing, feeding, and controlling enslaved individuals. So, while abolition ended the legal institution of slavery, it didn't erase the economic inequalities it created. Instead, it forced economies to shift in ways that continued to benefit those who had already amassed wealth from slavery. Now, let's examine the long-term financial impact of slavery and the ways in which modern institutions are still tied to its legacy. Even though slavery was legally abolished, its economic impact didn't just vanish. In fact, many of the financial structures, corporations, and institutions that thrived during the slave trade are still active today, and their historical profits continue to shape economic disparities around the world. One of the most persistent effects of the transatlantic slave trade is the lasting wealth gap. Generations of enslaved people were denied the opportunity to accumulate wealth, own property, or pass down financial assets. Meanwhile, the plantation owners, merchants, and industrialists who benefited from slavery were able to invest in land, businesses, and banks, creating generational wealth that continues to benefit their descendants. Today, former slave trading nations still experience significant racial income and wealth disparities, largely because centuries of stolen labor built fortunes for some while leaving others with nothing. But it's not just about individuals. Major financial institutions and corporations that existed during the time of slavery still operate today. Some of the world's biggest banks and insurance companies directly profited from slavery by providing loans to plantation owners, insuring enslaved individuals as property, and financing slave ships. These businesses didn't collapse when slavery ended, they evolved, reinvesting their wealth into other industries and continuing to grow. In some cases, institutions have acknowledged their past ties to slavery, but financial reparations remain a debated issue. This brings us to the growing movement for reparations. Across the world, activists, scholars, and governments have debated whether financial compensation should be provided to the descendants of enslaved people. Some argue that reparations are necessary to correct historical injustices, while others resist the idea, claiming that too much time has passed. However, discussions about economic justice are gaining traction, and in some cases, companies and institutions have pledged financial contributions to acknowledge their role in the slave trade. The economic legacy of slavery isn't just about history, it's about the world we live in today. The structures built on forced labor didn't disappear, they adapted, and their effects are still visible in modern economies. Now, let's take a closer look at how banks and financial institutions specifically profited from slavery and the role they played in shaping global finance. When we think of slavery, we often picture plantations and forced labor, but behind the scenes, banks and financial institutions were playing a crucial role in keeping the system running. Slavery wasn't just a labor system, it was an industry, and like any industry, it needed financing, investment, and risk management. That's where the banking sector stepped in, turning human lives into financial assets. Let's start with how banks directly financed slavery. Major European and American banks provided loans to plantation owners, allowing them to purchase more land and, more importantly, more enslaved people. Enslaved individuals weren't just laborious, they were considered property, and their value could be used as collateral for loans. This meant that if a plantation owner wanted to expand, they could borrow money from a bank, using the enslaved people they already owned as financial backing. The more enslaved workers they controlled, the more credit they could access, further entrenching the economic cycle of slavery. But it wasn't just about lending, insurance companies also played a significant role. Since enslaved individuals were treated as property, they could be insured just like livestock or buildings. Plantation owners and slave traders purchased policies to protect their investments in case of rebellion, accidental death, or even shipwrecks during the Middle Passage. Insurance companies made huge profits from these policies, creating a financial safety net that reduced the risks of slave trading and encouraged further exploitation. Even after slavery was abolished, many of these financial institutions survived and thrived. Some of today's biggest banks have historical ties to slavery, having either directly financed it or profited from industries that relied on enslaved labor. The wealth generated from these transactions didn't disappear, it was reinvested into new industries, helping to build the modern financial system. The link between slavery and finance isn't just a footnote in history, it's a foundational part of how global economies developed. Without slavery, many of the banks and financial institutions that shaped industrialized nations might not have accumulated the capital they needed to expand. Now that we've explored how banks played a role in slavery, let's look at how governments and institutions have responded to calls for reparations. As awareness of slavery's economic impact has grown, so too have discussions about reparations. But what exactly are reparations? Simply put, they are financial or institutional efforts to compensate for the injustices of slavery, whether through direct payments, social programs, or economic reforms. Around the world, different nations and institutions have approached this issue in various ways, but the debate over how to address slavery's lasting legacy is far from settled. One of the most vocal groups demanding reparations is CARICOM, an organization representing Caribbean nations. Many of these countries were built almost entirely on enslaved labor, generating enormous wealth for European colonial powers while leaving local populations in poverty. Today, CARICOM is pushing for former colonial powers, such as Britain, France, and the Netherlands, to acknowledge their role in the slave trade and provide compensation to Caribbean nations. Their demands range from direct payments to debt relief and development assistance to help address the economic inequalities created by centuries of exploitation. In the United States, reparations have been a topic of discussion for decades, but no large-scale federal program has ever been implemented. One of the most well-known proposals is H.R. 40, a bill that suggests creating a federal commission to study the impacts of slavery and explore possible forms of reparations for Black Americans. While some cities and institutions have taken steps toward acknowledging the economic legacy of slavery, the issue remains politically controversial, with strong opinions on both sides of the debate. Beyond governments, some corporations and universities have also started to address their historical ties to slavery. Some of the wealthiest institutions in the world, including Ivy League universities and major banks, have acknowledged that their foundations were built on profits from the slave trade. In response, some institutions have pledged financial contributions to black communities or established scholarship programs. However, many critics argue that these efforts fall far short of meaningful reparations and are more about symbolic gestures than genuine economic justice. Reparations remain one of the most complex and controversial topics in discussions about historical justice. While some argue that financial compensation is the only way to address slavery's economic legacy, others insist that no amount of money can undo the harm caused by centuries of forced labor and systemic oppression. As this debate continues, it raises an important question: how do we move forward in a way that acknowledges the past while shaping a more just future? Next, we'll explore the broader economic legacies of slavery and what they mean for today's world. The transatlantic slave trade may have ended long ago, but its economic consequences are still woven into the fabric of modern society. The wealth it created didn't just vanish, it was reinvested, expanded, and compounded over generations, while the communities it devastated were left struggling to catch up. Understanding these lingering economic effects is crucial for making sense of modern inequalities and the ongoing debates about justice and reparations. One of the most glaring legacies of slavery is the persistent racial wealth gap. In countries that were built on the backs of enslaved laborers, such as the United States, the economic disparities between the descendants of enslaved people and those who benefited from slavery remain massive. Land ownership, business opportunities, and access to capital were historically denied to black communities, while white families accumulated generational wealth through industries fueled by slavery. These historical injustices set the foundation for modern economic disparities, making it significantly harder for marginalized communities to break the cycle of poverty. Another lasting impact can be seen in global trade patterns. Many former slave trading nations still dominate international markets, while regions that were stripped of their populations and resources continue to struggle with economic instability. For example, many African and Caribbean nations that were once integral to the plantation economy still rely heavily on exporting raw materials rather than developing high-value industries. This is a direct result of the colonial and economic structures set in place during the era of slavery, which prioritized extraction over long-term development. Financial institutions also carry the imprint of slavery. Some of the world's most powerful banks, insurance companies, and investment firms can trace their origins to money made from the slave trade. Even though these institutions have evolved, the wealth they generated has continued to grow, compounding over centuries. In contrast, the enslaved and their descendants were systematically denied access to financial tools like loans, mortgages, and investments, further widening the economic gap. The legacy of slavery isn't just about the past, it's about the systems that still shape our world today. The economic inequalities that began during the transatlantic slave trade didn't disappear when slavery was abolished. They adapted and transformed into new forms of financial exclusion and systemic disadvantage. As we wrap up this discussion, one thing is clear: history isn't just something that happened, it's something that continues to influence the present. By understanding the economic consequences of slavery, we can have more informed conversations about how to address these long-standing disparities. If you found this video insightful, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Truth Behind History for more deep dives into the economic forces that shaped our world. History isn't just about memorizing dates, it's about uncovering the hidden connections that still affect us today. And if you want to explore more fascinating historical topics, check out the other videos on this channel. Whether it's war, politics, economics, or untold stories, there's always more to learn about the past and how it still shapes our future. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.